Dear Jimmy, the Lord willing, I should arrive in Albuquerque sometime the afternoon of the 7th. Father is still not pleased about my coming out to get you. But in my heart, I know it's the right thing to do. Love, Marion.
On a windy day in 1921, a young woman stepped off a Pullman car outside the Alvarado Hotel in downtown Albuquerque. Marion Kellogg thought she had come to accompany her intended, Jimmy Van Deventer, home from the Southwestern Presbyterian Sanatorium where he was being treated for tuberculosis. She couldn't have known then that she was about to abandon her dream of becoming a professional opera singer to instead become the soul of an organization dedicated to helping the ill and infirm. She couldn't know then that it was her destiny to become the legacy of Presbyterian Hospital and Healthcare Services. All Marion Kellogg knew on that windswept day way back in 1921 was that Jimmy needed her. It was known back then simply as the White Plague, and in 1918, like so many before and so many after him, Jimmy Van Deventer had come to Albuquerque chasing a cure for tuberculosis. In those days, it was thought that the arid New Mexico climate provided the perfect environment for healing. Yet while the sun and dry air had benefited him some, he was still desperately ill. He knew he could not survive a trip back east. Soon after arriving, so did Marion. As a young military school cadet in Virginia, Jimmy Van Deventer met Marion for the first time at a Sunday school picnic near Churchville. Upon returning home that evening, he told his mother, "Today I met the girl I'm going to marry." And while his prediction was to one day be proven true, Cadet Van Deventer had no inclination of the circumstances under which their union would occur, or in the faraway place where it would happen.
I think it was a huge undertaking to decide to stay out here, which to everyone back east, certainly her family who had never been out here, I mean, this was the Wild West.
Without her family's blessing, Marion made the decision to stay on in Albuquerque to be with her beloved Jimmy for as many days as he had left. She found work as a secretary to Reverend Hugh Cooper, the founder of Southwestern Presbyterian Sanatorium, where Jimmy was staying. She set up housekeeping in a tiny cottage on the corner of what is now Central and Cedar. And in the spring of 1922, with her future husband wearing his pajamas under his suit and her new boss, the Reverend Cooper, officiating, 11 years after they had first met, Marion Kellogg and Jimmy Van Deventer were finally wed. For Marion and Jimmy, life as a young married couple was far from idyllic. Shortly after the ceremony, Jimmy had to return to his sickbed. But what it lacked in material resources was certainly made up for in other ways.
Once, when we were down to our last 50 cents, I asked Jimmy, what should we do? Shall we be sensible and buy bread and groceries? Or shall we splurge and buy a box of candy? Well, without hesitation, we both blurted out, candy. It was such a treat. Until we woke up the next morning and found our dog Fuzzy had eaten most of the box.
On September 10th, 1929, after a 12-year battle with TB, Jimmy Van Deventer died. Marion would not remarry in her lifetime. Jimmy, she often said, was the only man for me. Most everyone connected with the San assumed that she would return to her family back east. Everyone, that is, except Marion Van Deventer.
Her family, of course, just knew she was going to come home, that she'd gotten this Southwestern thing out of her system and that she didn't have any reason to be here anymore. And she told me of her staying in Albuquerque, that she felt that the Lord had called her to be here and to share Christ's love with people throughout Presbyterian Hospital Center and any of the people she came in contact with in New Mexico.
Marion Van Deventer had indeed decided to stay and help Reverend Cooper continue his work. A former tuberculosis patient himself, the Reverend Hugh Cooper was more fortunate than most. He had regained his health rather quickly and had never suffered a recurrence of TB after coming to Albuquerque in 1903. Shortly after his recovery, he became pastor of the First Presbyterian Church and in 1908 founded the Southwestern Presbyterian Sanatorium, a facility whose sole purpose was to care for the hundreds of TB patients coming to the city. As his executive assistant, Mrs. Van, as she had come to be known, had many duties. In addition to secretarial work, she was also involved in billing, fundraising, and in 1923 began what was to become a 53-year run as editor of a newsletter she created and called the Sanatorium Quarterly.
Sanatorium Quarterly is the paper that Mrs. Van sent to the Friends of the Sanatorium for many years. It was a little paper that she wrote that told about patients and solicited funds for patients. And she would tell about the life story of one particular patient who really needed some help in order to stay in the San. And if he could stay in the San just a little bit longer, he would probably be well and would be able to go out into the world.
Mrs. Van loved the sanatorium and everything it stood for. She began a national health stamp program as a way of raising funds and publicizing the institution. She started a patient library. She encouraged the groundskeeper to plant year-round so that fresh flowers could always be placed in patients' rooms, and she was never too busy to write a note to a patient or counsel them on a personal problem. Yet just as she was settling into her new life, Mrs. Van faced another crisis.
It is with very sad hearts that we send you this word. Our very dear Dr. Cooper was called to his heavenly home on December 12th. He leaves a most glorious monument here for the help and care of the needy sick. And to you as our helpers, we come with humble hearts this day. We pray God's blessing on each one of you this new year, and may we all work together for the healing of mankind. Marion Van Deventer, December 27th, 1934.
Once again, Marion Van Deventer was on her own. Only this time an entire organization looked to her for leadership during the worst economic time in our country's history. Mrs. Van would not disappoint. By the 1930s, patients were coming to the Southwestern Presbyterian Sanatorium from all over the country and as far away as Europe and Asia. However, because of the economic difficulties of the time, many were not able to pay for their hospitalization. Mrs. Van made fundraising a personal mission. She sent out penny postcards and asked recipients to pin $1 to each and send it back. She traveled back east soliciting funds, but only from those who had an actual interest in the San. She once told a potential donor, "If you're not interested in our patients, I don't want your money." The donor doubled his gift. The San survived the Depression. When the hardships surrounding the war years came along, Mrs. Van's dedication to the San and its patients continued. A young Japanese patient named Emma Fukuda Sato tells the story of the morning of December 7th, 1941.
One Sunday morning after church service, I went back to my room and lay on the bed. The radio was playing a beautiful symphony. All of a sudden, the music stopped with an announcement of emergency news. Japan has bombed Pearl Harbor. I locked my door, got into bed, covered my head with blankets, and I wished I could disappear. Then a knock on the door. I did not want to see anyone, but it was Mother Van's voice. I opened the door. She hugged me and kissed my cheek. "Don't worry, Emma. I'm here with you, and I will help you."
Mrs. Van always considered the San's patients to be her extended family, and she cared for them as such. Emma went on to become a missionary in Thailand, and to this day, she credits her time at the Presbyterian Sanatorium and the love she received from Mrs. Van as the major influences in her life.
I'm a born optimist, and I love change, and I love to see things grow and change. 9 times out of 10, it's better. And if it doesn't work, well, you can always do something else. Marion Van Deventer, September 25th, 1978.
By the early 1950s, modern medicine was bringing tuberculosis under control. Consequently, revenue was down and the Sands' future was in doubt. The board of directors, along with Mrs. Van, decided bringing in a professional hospital administrator was what was needed. When asked what part of her job she would be willing to give up to the new administrator, Mrs. Van happily replied, all of it.
There had to be some changes made. That place was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was probably 6 months away from bankruptcy. And now to come in and try to change something, and here's a lady been sitting there since 1918, you can understand why I was a little apprehensive about that. But the changes we had to make, she did not object at all. She went along and totally supported them.
With the new administration came a new name. From that day forward, the Southwestern Presbyterian Sanatorium would now be known as the Presbyterian Hospital Center. In 1954, the Bureau of Indian Affairs contracted with the new Presbyterian Hospital Center to take care of Indian patients with TB, most of which were children. The sheer number of patients quickly meant special help was needed. Fortunately, a volunteer stepped forward to coordinate the loving care these children so desperately needed. A volunteer by the name of Mrs. Van.
The Indian children all loved Mrs. Van and really had a great time during the months that they were there. They had lung specialists who were prescribing their medicine and taking care of them. They had registered school teachers who took care of their education. And they had the volunteers who, at Mrs. Van's urging, came in to help play with them.
Over 100 Native American children would eventually come to know and love Mrs. Van. But the children were only one area where Mrs. Van saw a need and actively tried to meet it.
She decided that there was a need for volunteers in the hospital, so she and a couple of the doctors' wives started it. And we started out very small. That was before all the changes at the hospital, all the new buildings. And we had 1 or 2 services, book cart, coffee cart, things like that. We started out. But she was really responsible for it, getting it going.
Mrs. Van for years had raised money for the SAN, for the patients of the SAN. She understood that there were many people who really could not afford their own care. And Mrs. Van started Hospital Services Corporation. It came to be known as Blue Cross. She started a health plan before people really even knew what health insurance and health plans were. And we take it for granted today.
I was a good nursing assistant, and I was interested in going to school, but I didn't have the money at the time to pay for the tuition. Mrs. Van wanted anybody who was interested to have a chance, and that she didn't want the financial end of it to be a burden. I was grateful that Mrs. Van paid my tuition, and I've been nursing at Presbyterian ever since.
Mrs. Van was never shy about giving of herself or in asking others. While most would consider fundraising a necessary evil, Mrs. Van considered it a pleasure. For her, the formation of the Presbyterian Healthcare Foundation was simply yet another way to care for people.
I was a little hesitant about raising money when I first started there. And she said, well, Mary, you're not asking for the money for yourself, you know. And so that every time I'd think, oh, can I really do this? I'd think of her, that you're not asking for yourself.
Into the 60s and 70s, the hospital continued to grow. The years ahead would see the opening of Casement Hospital, a satellite facility in northeast Albuquerque, the formation of the state's first HMO health plan, and the establishment of a statewide multi-hospital system. Mrs. Van considered all of it a godsend. In her words, it gave her more opportunities to pursue her ministry. Rather than try to control all the changes around her, she embraced them.
Mrs. Van came into my office and closed the door, and I thought, oh boy, here it comes. And she, I was thinking about her at that point, 48 years of seniority to my 1 week. And I kind of figured that she was coming in to explain what the organization was really like. She said to me that I just want you to know that my job is to help you in any way that I can, so please call on me anytime you think I might be of help. And she turned around, opened the door, and left. And I just kind of thought, wow. I mean, she'd been there 48 years, what she knew compared to what I knew, and she said, I'm here to help you.
She never did retire, let's face it. She finally went off salary and onto pension because she thought it would help the hospital. But if it's good for the hospital, I'll go along with it. That was always her attitude.
Her importance at board meetings, I think, in the last 20 years of her life was just her presence of a reminder that people are important, and we may be talking about major business decisions or financial concerns, but let's not forget about people. Her presence at the table was a wonderful reminder of why the hospital existed.
She knew every employee, knew their families, their kids, and what was going on. She fit in anywhere that some help was needed. Of course, she wasn't a professional nurse, but her goodwill and calling on people probably did as much good as nursing did sometime.
We used to say to her, you know, Mrs. Van, you're really an honorary nurse. And she'd say, well, dear, that's all well and good, but all of us should be caring, and all of us should treat others as though they were guests in your home.
For many years, I thought that I was Mrs. Van's best friend, and so did several thousand other people, because she treated all of us as her best friends.
When you receive this letter, I will have gone to be with the Lord and my dear ones in heaven. My life had many unusual turns, but I would not change a single one of them. I am grateful for all things and hope and pray some small service of mine has been helpful to you along life's path. Marion Kellogg Van Deventer, December 1984.
The life story of Mrs. Van and the history of Presbyterian are often recounted in the same breath, because for as long as anyone can remember, one was the other. Mrs. Van passed away on December 3, 1984. More than 6 decades of her life were devoted to caring for both patients and employees of Presbyterian. She has been described as doing everything but run the switchboard. Her presence was felt throughout the hospital, from the kitchen to the laundry to the patient floors. In short, she was always willing to be wherever she was needed most.
It's interesting the number of times that we're in meetings in this organization today where someone will say, I wonder what Mrs. Van would do. And you know, it sounds corny the first time you hear it, but no one cracks a joke, no one dismisses that as being something that is inappropriate. People usually get a very thoughtful look on their face, and they think about Mrs. Van, and they think about their personal relationship to Mrs. Van. And it's amazing how it has guided some decisions when that's been raised. I think there are people that are put on this earth that are totally selfless, that truly put others' needs before theirs at all times, and she was one of those people. By never losing sight of who this lady was, I think we can make the right decisions that will ensure that we're here 90 years from now.
Perhaps the late Dr. Jack Redmond said it best in a poem he wrote about her. This place will hold the love that light reflects, the holy love of Jesus, Son of Man. And future generations all will know that God is here, and so is Mrs. Van.